My name is Richard Holloway, and by the time Daniel stood in that Manchester office and told me my shares were worth nothing, I had already lost more than money. I had lost the version of myself that believed fatherhood was protection against betrayal. I remember the way Kyle Benton adjusted his cufflinks while explaining dilution, as if erasing me from Holloway Sustainable Solutions was a routine administrative correction, and Daniel, my own son, couldn't meet my eyes because somewhere between Manchester and Manhattan he had decided I was expendable. The humiliation didn't explode inside me, it hollowed me out. 8 years of wiring funds from Surrey, remortgaging the house Margaret loved, signing personal guarantees with Barclays, covering legal restructures across London and New York, all of it reduced to a technicality. I felt my identity detach from me in that office. Founder, investor, father, provider, gone. What replaced it wasn't rage, it was stillness, a cold recalibration. I replayed every late-night call, every "it's temporary, Dad," every time Daniel reassured me while Kyle quietly repositioned the board. I realized they hadn't just diluted shares, they had studied me, anticipated my trust, counted on my silence. Something inside me collapsed quietly and never stood back up. And in that silence, something far more dangerous began to form. That was the moment I stopped being his father and started becoming his reckoning.
The betrayal didn't echo, it absorbed sound. When Kyle Benton said, "Your original shares were diluted to zero," the Manchester office felt smaller, like the air had been professionally extracted. I remember noticing the new logo first, HSS Global Ltd, sleek, metallic, deliberately international. My surname had been removed from the glass door outside. Holloway was gone, as if it had never anchored the foundation. Daniel stood slightly behind Kyle, not beside him, behind him. That detail keeps replaying in my mind. My son positioned like a junior partner while an American operations director explained to me how I no longer existed inside my own creation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even sit down. I just nodded. I asked for clarification, calmly, methodically. I wanted to hear the words again. I wanted to understand how 8 years of funding, £320,000 from retirement savings, remortgaging our Surrey home, covering shipments stuck in Boston, guaranteeing the Barclays credit line, how all of that became zero. Kyle spoke in polished tones about venture capital expectations in Manhattan, about equity restructuring during the latest funding round, about investor confidence from Chicago and New York. Daniel finally muttered, "It wasn't personal, Dad." Not personal. I remember thinking how strange that sentence sounded in his voice, because it was deeply personal. What I saw, Kyle's confidence, Daniel's discomfort, the new framed acquisition letter on the wall from a private equity group in New York, the celebration bottle of champagne chilling discreetly near the conference table. What I felt, pressure behind my ribs, a kind of implosion, not anger, not yet, just a violent compression of trust. What I didn't say, I signed the original shareholder agreement. I personally negotiated supplier contracts in Ohio under my name. I guaranteed early distribution deals outside Birmingham. I built this. You built on top of me. What I pretended not to notice, the email printed on Kyle's desk from HSS Global Acquisition Team, dated 3 months earlier. 3 months. They had known for 3 months. The humiliation didn't end when I walked out of that office. It followed me into the car. It sat beside me on the drive back to Surrey. It stood in the hallway when Margaret asked how the meeting went. I told her it was complicated. I didn't have the language yet for erasure. That night, I opened the drawer in my study where I kept every document: transfer records, bank confirmations, the original incorporation papers listing me as founding shareholder of Holloway Sustainable Solutions, my signature beside Daniel's, preemption rights clearly outlined, protection clauses, safeguards. Kyle Benton hadn't started this company. He had entered in year 5. Daniel hadn't structured the early agreements. He was too inexperienced at 26. I had. And yet, somehow, legally, I was nothing. That realization stripped something permanent away from me. It wasn't just money, it was status. In London filings, in Manchester business circles, in U.S. supplier contracts, I had been the stabilizing guarantor, the quiet adult in the room. Without equity, I wasn't just removed financially, I was rewritten historically. Founders are remembered, lenders are not. I sat there under the desk lamp and replayed every conversation from the past year, every delay in sending me updated cap tables, every time Daniel said, "We'll formalize things once the U.S. deal closes," every time Kyle insisted restructuring was standard. It wasn't oversight. It was sequencing. They waited until investor interest peaked. They waited until acquisition was imminent. They waited until my leverage seemed irrelevant. Then they erased me. I realized something else, something colder. Daniel hadn't defended me in that room because he had already accepted the narrative that I was temporary capital. Temporary. 8 years of fatherhood reframed as seed funding. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because it didn't. It intensified. By midnight, I understood that my silence in that office hadn't been weakness. It had been observation. I hadn't confronted Kyle because I needed him comfortable. I hadn't argued with Daniel because I needed him unaware. I called Andrew Whitmore in London the next morning. Old university friend, corporate solicitor, methodical mind. I didn't dramatize. I explained the dilution, the acquisition, the preemption clause. There was a pause on the line. Then Andrew said quietly, "Richard, they may have violated your rights." May have. 2 words, but they shifted the balance. Because if they had bypassed preemption rights during the funding round, then the dilution wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was angry, but because something else had surfaced. Clarity. The betrayal wasn't impulsive, it was engineered. Documents delayed intentionally, filings timed carefully, my trust weaponized strategically. This wasn't my son being naive, this was coordination. And as I stared at the shareholder agreement under my desk lamp, one thought settled with terrifying certainty. They didn't underestimate my intelligence, they underestimated my patience. And that was their first mistake. I didn't return to the Manchester office. Not because I was avoiding Daniel or Kyle Benton, but because absence is often more unsettling than confrontation. Silence leaves space for assumptions, and assumptions make people careless. For the first time in 8 years, I stopped calling. I stopped asking for updates about shipments to Boston or supplier contracts in Ohio. I didn't inquire about the Manhattan office or their pending acquisition deal. I let Holloway Sustainable Solutions, no, HSS Global Ltd., move forward without me. And they did, almost eagerly. Through quiet channels, I learned that Daniel and Kyle were celebrating. The acquisition discussions with the New York private equity group were advancing. Investors from Chicago were impressed with projected expansion into U.S. retail chains. The Birmingham warehouse had scaled operations, and the London filings were being updated to reflect the new ownership structure. My removal had simplified things. That's what they believed. I watched from a distance. Not as a father, not even as a wronged investor, but as someone who had once built the structural spine of what they were now trying to sell. Andrew Whitmore kept me informed without fanfare. He was reviewing the original shareholder agreement, the preemption clauses, the dilution mechanics used in the last funding round. He didn't dramatize either, just facts, quietly assembling pressure. Meanwhile, Daniel relaxed. That was the first sign. He began speaking publicly again, something he hadn't done during the restructuring phase. He gave an interview to a Manchester business podcast talking about HSS Global's international growth strategy. He mentioned Kyle by name. He mentioned Manhattan. He mentioned venture capital confidence. He did not mention me, not once. I listened to the full interview late one evening in Surrey while Margaret read nearby. My name had become a historical inconvenience, edited out of the narrative. That hurt more than the dilution, because money can be replaced, but authorship of something you built, that is identity. Still, I remained silent, invisible, underestimated. And in that invisibility, I noticed something they didn't. Kyle had accelerated the company's credit exposure. Expansion into the U.S. wasn't being funded purely by investment. It leaned heavily on the original Barclays line of credit, the same line I had personally guaranteed. It hadn't been replaced. It hadn't been refinanced. It was still anchored to me. That detail wasn't publicly visible. Investors saw growth metrics. They saw logistics scaling. They saw the Manhattan office. But I saw dependency. Because without my personal guarantee, the credit facility became unstable, and without stable credit, U.S. expansion slowed significantly. Andrew confirmed what I suspected. Legally, the guarantee remained mine alone, not Daniel's, not Kyle's, mine. And more importantly, it was reviewable. I didn't move immediately. Revenge that arrives too quickly looks emotional. This had to feel procedural, routine, almost administrative. So instead of confronting them, I requested a formal review of my personal financial obligations with Barclays, quietly. No accusations, no legal threats, just a reassessment of risk exposure tied to entities where I no longer held equity. The bank responded, predictably. Within 10 days, they contacted HSS Global Ltd. Standard practice, routine due diligence, nothing dramatic. Except suddenly, Daniel and Kyle had to explain why their primary credit line was backed by someone who legally owned nothing in the company. I wasn't attacking them. I was removing myself. That was the difference. And it unsettled them. Because the first email from Kyle arrived late at night. Polite, measured. Richard, Barclays mentioned a review. I'm sure this is procedural, but perhaps we should discuss. I didn't respond immediately. I waited 24 hours, then replied with one sentence. Just ensuring my personal exposure aligns with my current position. No anger, no accusation, just alignment. But alignment creates friction when structures were built on assumption. Within days, the tone shifted. The second email was less composed. Daniel called. His voice was tight. Dad, the bank is asking questions. It's affecting timelines. Timelines. Not apologies, not explanations. Timelines. That was the moment I understood something important. They still didn't see me as an opponent. They saw me as an inconvenience, which meant they hadn't adjusted their strategy yet, and that gave me space. Because the hidden weakness wasn't just the credit line. It was dependency layered across international growth. Boston suppliers relied on payment cycles tied to that facility. Chicago expansion forecasts assumed liquidity. The Manhattan office lease had been signed based on projected access to capital, and capital, quietly, still traced back to me. I didn't threaten to withdraw the guarantee. I simply allowed the possibility to exist, and that possibility was enough. Investors paused. Nothing public, nothing catastrophic, just hesitation, questions, clarifications, tiny delays, the kind that ripple invisibly through acquisition timelines. Kyle called again a week later. This time, the confidence had thinned. "Richard, we can sort this out." I almost smiled when I heard it, not because I had won anything, but because for the first time since Manchester, he was no longer speaking from certainty. He was negotiating with uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads, quietly. I ended the call calmly. No commitment, no refusal, just patience. Because this wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning of pressure. They thought the worst had already happened when I walked out of that office. They thought dilution had closed the chapter, but I knew something they didn't. This story hadn't ended in Manchester. It had only just begun.
Pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps. At first, Daniel didn't acknowledge it publicly. The Manchester podcast appearance was still circulating. The Manhattan office continued posting optimistic updates about U.S. retail partnerships, and Kyle Benton maintained his usual composed tone in investor calls. On paper, HSS Global Limited was stable, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Barclays had not withdrawn anything. They had simply asked questions, and questions in business are rarely neutral. Payment cycles slowed, not halted, just stretched. A supplier in Boston requested reassurances before dispatching the next shipment. A Chicago distributor asked for written confirmation of credit continuity. The Manhattan office delayed onboarding 2 new hires tied to expansion forecasts. Nothing dramatic, just friction. The kind that doesn't appear in press releases, but echoes in internal meetings. I remained still, invisible, watching. Andrew Whitmore updated me from London with quiet precision. Investors had begun requesting clarification about the guarantee structure, not aggressively, just cautiously. And caution breeds suspicion. Kyle began responding defensively in email threads, over-explaining liquidity positions, attaching projections that hadn't been questioned before. Daniel, according to Andrew's contact inside the Manchester office, had started double-checking financial summaries personally, instead of delegating. That was new. Daniel had always trusted momentum. Now he was verifying. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like diligence. And that change rippled outward. The acquisition timeline, once spoken about with certainty, began acquiring conditional language, pending review, subject to alignment, dependent on facility continuity. Words that mean delay. Delay creates anxiety, and anxiety erodes confidence. I felt something unfamiliar as I watched it unfold. Not satisfaction, transformation. Because revenge, when executed quietly, begins to reshape the person carrying it. I noticed how calm I had become. Margaret would speak about ordinary things in Surrey, garden repairs, weekend plans, and I would nod while mentally tracking investor hesitations in New York or supplier caution in Ohio. I wasn't angry anymore. I was attentive, measured, strategic. And that realization unsettled me more than Daniel's betrayal ever had. Because this wasn't who I used to be. I had spent years believing loyalty was strength. Now I was learning that silence could be leverage, and leverage changes identity. Meanwhile, time began closing in on them. The acquisition deal wasn't open-ended. The private equity group in New York had set a preliminary deadline, 60 days to finalize due diligence, 60 days to ensure stability, 60 days to confirm growth projections, 60 days to prove that HSS Global's expansion into the U.S. wasn't dependent on fragile structures. And suddenly, everything depended on the quiet question Barclays had raised. Would the guarantee remain? Kyle started calling more frequently, not confrontationally, but persistently. Each call framed as collaboration. "Richard, we just need clarity." Clarity. Not fairness, not reconciliation, just operational certainty. Daniel didn't call again. That told me more than anything. He was afraid of what I might say, or worse, what I might not. Because silence forces imagination, and imagination invents threats faster than reality delivers them. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? I continued pretending. I attended a charity dinner in London. I responded politely to Andrew's updates. I reviewed old documents late at night in my study. Transfer records, supplier contracts, the original incorporation paperwork. And then, one evening, Andrew said something that changed everything. "There's another layer," he told me over the phone. His tone was different, less analytical, more cautious. The early supplier agreements, those signed during the first 2 years when Holloway Sustainable Solutions struggled for credibility, had not been fully reassigned during restructuring. Some remained personally tied to me, not the company, me. Which meant if disputes escalated, certain supply chains could legally require my involvement or consent to continue under revised corporate ownership. I didn't respond immediately, because I understood what that meant. This wasn't just about credit anymore. It was about continuity. And continuity is survival. Without stable supply, expansion collapses. Without expansion, acquisition dies. Kyle and Daniel believed they had removed me structurally, but operationally, I was still embedded. Deeply. Quietly. Invisibly. And they didn't know. Not yet. But they would. Because the next phase wasn't about hesitation. It was about inevitability. And for the first time since that morning in Manchester, I understood something with complete certainty. I didn't just have leverage. I had access to something catastrophic. The first visible crack didn't appear in Manchester. It surfaced in Manhattan. Not publicly, not in headlines or filings, but in tone. A scheduled investor briefing was postponed. Officially, it was framed as alignment timing. Internally, it was hesitation. The private equity group in New York had begun asking about operational continuity, specifically whether supplier agreements in Ohio and Boston were fully secured under HSS Global Ltd's current structure. They weren't, and that uncertainty spread faster than any legal modus could. Daniel called me again. This time there was no attempt to sound casual. "Dad, investors are asking questions about early supplier contracts." I listened. He didn't accuse. He didn't apologize. He just spoke like someone standing on unstable ground. Kyle followed with a separate call that same evening. His tone had changed completely. The polished executive from New York was gone, replaced by someone calculating risk in real time. "Richard, we may need your cooperation to reassure continuity." Cooperation. The word lingered, because cooperation implies dependency, and dependency implies vulnerability. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree. I simply said, "I'll review any formal request." Outwardly calm. Inside, I understood something they didn't. This moment wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a reaction to Barclays' review or investor nerves. It was inevitable. Because the truth was, the framework of this outcome had been set in motion long before that gray October morning in Manchester.
Years earlier, during the company's fragile beginnings, I had insisted on signing certain supplier contracts personally. At the time, Daniel had been too young to command trust from established logistics partners in Boston and Ohio. They wanted stability. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone with history. So I stepped in. I signed. I guaranteed. I anchored relationships under my own name. Not out of foresight, out of necessity. But necessity becomes leverage when history is rewritten. Kyle had restructured equity. He had renamed the company. He had repositioned ownership. But he hadn't rebuilt the foundation. Because foundations are slow to replicate and impossible to replace overnight. As investor concern grew, subtle consequences began surfacing. The Chicago distributor paused its onboarding timeline. The Birmingham warehouse adjusted outbound scheduling. The Manhattan office quietly delayed expansion hires again. Nothing collapsed, but everything slowed. Kyle attempted to confront me directly, not through lawyers, through presence. He flew to London. We met in a quiet hotel lounge near Canary Wharf. He remained composed, but the confidence was gone. We didn't anticipate this overlap, he admitted. Overlap, a sanitized word for dependency. I watched him carefully. He tried persuasion first. Richard, aligning these agreements would stabilize the acquisition. Then reassurance. You'd be recognized for your early contributions. Recognition, as if identity could be retroactively granted. Finally, subtle pressure. Delays could harm everyone involved, including Daniel. There it was. Not threat, but implication. I responded simply, I'm aware. And that was enough, because this wasn't negotiation anymore. It was consequence. The machinery had already started moving. Barclay's review was ongoing. Investors were hesitating. Suppliers were cautious. Legal clarity was being questioned, and none of it required aggression from me, just existence. Because the revenge they feared wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it was structural, and structures fail slowly until they don't. Andrew confirmed what I already sensed. Even if agreements were reassigned now, investor confidence had already been shaken. Due diligence timelines were tightening, deadlines approaching, trust thinning. Kyle's trip to London wasn't proactive, it was reactive, which meant the shift had already happened. The balance of power had moved, irreversibly. Daniel called later that night. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I didn't think it would unfold like this. Neither had I. But inevitability rarely announces itself in advance. It reveals itself through sequence. And the sequence was now beyond anyone's control. Because what they were facing wasn't a threat. It was history asserting ownership. And by the time they understood that, the damage had already begun.
By the time the pressure became visible to the outside world, it was already suffocating on the inside. Manchester felt different. Not in appearance. The office still carried the sleek HSS global branding, the Birmingham warehouse still moved shipments, and the Manhattan team continued presenting growth forecasts, but in atmosphere. Silence had replaced momentum. Emails were shorter, meetings ran longer, and Daniel had stopped speaking publicly altogether. The acquisition timeline from New York was now dangerously close to expiring. 60 days had once seemed generous, now it felt like a countdown. Andrew Whitmore's updates from London grew more frequent. Investors were requesting formal assurance that supplier continuity in Ohio and Boston could survive structural reassignment. Barclays was nearing the end of its review, and the private equity group had issued a quiet warning. Uncertainty must be resolved before final approval. Everything now depended on decisions that could no longer be postponed. And for the first time since this began, I felt something unstable inside myself. Not doubt about the strategy, but doubt about the cost. Because revenge, when executed slowly, begins to isolate. Margaret noticed it before I admitted it. "You're not present," she said one evening in Surrey. She didn't ask what I was doing, she already knew, and in that moment I realized something unsettling. I had stopped thinking like a father entirely. Daniel wasn't my son in this process. He was an executive whose decisions had consequences. That transformation felt necessary, but it also felt irreversible, and that frightened me, because I was no longer trying to restore the past. I was trying to control the future, and control demands distance. The breaking point arrived quietly. Barclays informed HSS Global that the credit facility would require reaffirmation of guarantee alignment within 10 business days. Not withdrawal, not termination, alignment. But alignment required my cooperation. Without it, expansion projections tied to Chicago and Manhattan became speculative, and speculative growth kills acquisitions. Kyle called immediately. His voice carried urgency now. "This can't wait." Daniel didn't call. He came in person, to Surrey. He stood in my study, the same room where I had once reviewed transfer records to save his company from collapse. He looked older, not physically, but structurally, like someone who had seen the scaffolding of his certainty begin to bend. "I didn't realize how much depended on you," he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission, and for a moment, just a moment, I nearly stopped, nearly offered alignment, nearly restored the balance, because the cost of continuing was no longer abstract. If the acquisition failed, HSS Global could survive, but weakened. Daniel's reputation would suffer. Kyle's position would become unstable. Expansion into the U.S. would stall indefinitely, and the company I had helped build would carry scars that might never fully heal. I asked myself something I hadn't allowed before. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? The answer didn't come easily, because finishing meant accepting that some fractures don't repair. But walking away meant accepting erasure, and I had already lived through that once. The reversal came not from anger, but from clarity. Andrew discovered that the private equity group had initiated a secondary review after noticing inconsistencies in early governance filings. Not because of me, because of Kyle. Certain restructuring disclosures hadn't been fully transparent. Nothing illegal, but enough to trigger scrutiny. And scrutiny changes perception. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just about my guarantees, it was about leadership judgment. Investor confidence in Kyle Benton began to thin, quietly, internally. And that was when Daniel understood, truly understood. Not through contracts, not through banks, but through consequence. He called me that night. No hesitation this time, no distance. "Is this because of you?" I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it. I simply said, "It's because of decisions." And in that silence, recognition settled. Because for the first time since Manchester, Daniel realized who was dismantling the certainty around him.
Collapse doesn't always sound like failure. Sometimes it sounds like paperwork. The acquisition didn't implode overnight. It unraveled, quietly, methodically. The private equity group in New York extended their review period once, but not out of confidence, out of caution. Their secondary governance concerns, tied to Kyle Benton's restructuring disclosures, deepened scrutiny across both the UK and US filings. Questions that once felt procedural became strategic. Who had built the foundation? Who had guaranteed stability? Who had actually controlled continuity? And more importantly, who had been removed? Kyle tried to contain it. He held investor calls, issued revised projections, framed delays as due diligence complexity. But perception had shifted. Investors were no longer evaluating growth, they were evaluating judgment. And judgment, once questioned, rarely recovers. Barclays finalized their position shortly after.
Without formal alignment of my guarantee, credit exposure would require restructuring. Not termination, not hostility, just recalibration. But recalibration under scrutiny is lethal to expansion narratives. Chicago distribution scaled back onboarding. The Manhattan office suspended new commitments. Boston suppliers requested revised assurances. Each step was rational. Each step was reasonable. And each step weakened the illusion of momentum. Kyle called one final time. No persuasion, no pressure, only resignation. We can't stabilize this without you. I didn't respond immediately, because this moment wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about conclusion. The board convened in Manchester 2 weeks later. Daniel was there. Kyle was there. Andrew Whittemore attended as my legal representative. No raised voices, no accusations, just acknowledgement. The settlement was structured carefully. My equity was restored, with interest reflecting dilution damage. Kyle Benton was removed from operational authority. Revised filings across London and New York formally recognized me as co-founder. The supplier agreements were reassigned under stabilized governance, and the Barclays guarantee was renegotiated on my terms, not as leverage, as alignment. The acquisition didn't proceed, not immediately, but the company survived, and survival under corrected ownership became its new foundation. Daniel didn't speak much during the final meeting. When he did, it wasn't defensive, it wasn't emotional, it was factual. We misjudged what could be removed. That was the closest thing to apology, and it was enough. Because revenge had never been about destruction, it had been about restoration. I didn't return to daily operations. I didn't reclaim visibility. I stepped back, retained my shares, secured quarterly dividends, ensured structural respect was no longer optional. What I lost could never be returned. 8 years of trust, the belief that loyalty protected identity, the illusion that family insulated ambition from consequence. But what I reclaimed was something quieter: control, truth, dignity. Because silence had forced recognition, patience had restored authorship, and underestimation had rewritten history. Daniel learned something no contract could teach. Loyalty isn't something you dilute. And I learned something far more enduring. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.